Various roles in the community sector, including the Mental Health Council of Australia and Homelessness Australia. He's currently Executive Officer at Shelter ACT, the peak body representing the interests of affordable housing consumers in the ACT. As a White Ribbon Ambassador, Travis recognises the importance of men taking responsibility and playing a leadership role in preventing men's violence against women. Please welcome Travis.
Thanks, Glenda, and I'm really pleased to have been invited to speak on this topic on Human Rights Day. Before I get started, I know Glenda's done so, but I'd also like to acknowledge that we do meet, and I am speaking today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and future. I think if there's one group of people in this country that understand homelessness and sadly domestic and even lateral violence more than any other group, it is the first Australians. So I thought I'd start with a bit of a personal story. Way back when I was at university and doing the first of my postgraduate degrees, this one in social work, and inevitably placement time comes around and you try to test those wonderful theories like systems theory that you read about in the books and how they apply to the real world. And anyway, after 3 such placements, I determined that I certainly wasn't cut out to be a direct social work practitioner in frontline practice, but alas, I'm digressing. Anyway, in finding out what it was like to put those theories into practice, I met a young girl who today I'll call Mia. And Mia was, I suppose, like many young children do, playing with dolls from the pre-loved toy collection that had been donated to the service at which I met her. And she dressed the now almost hairless Barbie. It had obviously been played with by a number of people, lost most of its hair in formal clothes. And I said naively, "Barbie looks all dressed up. Where's she going?" And I was a bit taken aback by Mia's reply. Mia said, "Barbie's got caught today." After talking for a little while, and later becoming privy to some of the details of the events of Mia and her mother's lives, it turned out that at the age of 6, Mia had spent more time living in cars and domestic and family violence refuges than she had conventional homes. And her mum had been to court a number of times to seek apprehended violence orders against multiple partners, and to tell her stories over and over again of the brutality at the hands of male intimate partners. So for Mia, the experience of mum dressing up in formal clothes to go to court had been normalised, as had the experience of violence and abuse. This story has stayed with me in all of its inglorious detail for more than a decade, and it's this and stories like it, and my personal experience of helping female friends escape domestic violence themselves, that led me to apply to become a White Ribbon Ambassador. So I thought I'd start with a brief history of human rights. Following the tragedies of the Second World War, representatives from about 190 countries around the world met and agreed to sign up to the Charter of Human Rights and to form international alliances that would promote things like peace, cooperation and human rights across the globe. And various bodies within the United Nations over time, in consultation with NGOs and government agencies and other organisations, have developed a series of conventions and covenants and declarations, the main one of which Glenda referred to in her opening remarks, that tend to focus on specific areas and specific interest groups. And unlike many other countries, particularly in the EU and elsewhere, none of these instruments are technically binding under Australian law. So once ratified, they can place a degree, and they do place a degree of political and moral pressure on the state to ensure that citizens are protected and that these rights are enforced or set out in provisions like Acts of Parliament. But they're not legally binding. And so we see that the right to housing does not appear in any of the Australian Human Rights Acts. Three of these international covenants and declarations I think are particularly relevant to domestic and family violence. Obviously the Convention on the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. I don't know why I've got the rights of the child before the elimination of violence against women, but we'll skip and reverse that order. I reorganised this at 9 o'clock this morning. So Article 1, for the purposes of the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, defines violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. And violence against women under Article 2 is understood to encompass, but not be limited to, physical, sexual and psychological violence occurring in the family, including battering, sexual abuse of female children in the household, dowry-related violence, marital rape, female genital mutilation and other traditional practices harmful to women, and non-spousal violence and violence related to exploitation. It also extends to the general community. Under Article 3 it states that women are entitled to inter alia rights to life, equality, liberty and security of person, the right to equal protection under the law, the right to be free of all forms of discrimination, the right to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health, and the right to just and favourable conditions of work. And we know that that's actually becoming a greater issue that is being flagged by particular unions and others to allow for provisions such as domestic and family violence related leave. There's 6 articles to that convention, but I'll just touch on Article 4 that commits all parties that have signed up to adopt things like national plans and policies and practices to work towards the elimination of violence against women, and that's where Australia's national plan to eliminate violence against women comes from, or emerged out of. The UN Convention on the Rights of a Child was a long time coming. It was first talked about prior to the UN formally existing in about 1923, I think, and it didn't become formalised until 1959. But it's quite clear to see how domestic and family violence violates the following 4 of the core principles: the right to survival, the right to develop to the fullest, protection from harmful influences, abuse and exploitation, and the right to participate fully in family, cultural and social life. I might just skip over to my notes on human rights and domestic and family violence in Australia now. Human rights are said to have the following common attributes. They are inalienable, enunciation, universal and indivisible. They are equal, interrelated. It's hard to imagine, for me, a more grossly overt violation of fundamental human rights than the experience of domestic and family violence. Yet conceptualising gender-based violence as a human rights issue is very recent, and in fact, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women was only adopted by the United Nations in 1992. And indeed, it's hard for me to believe that it was not more than a generation ago in Australia that it was perhaps not uncommon for people, or at least men, to believe that some women just selected violent partners or were unlucky, they had the bastard gene, and that was how they understood loving relationships. Or worse, that women actually enjoyed it and derived masochistic pleasure from domestic and family violence. And it took years of intense activism from women to even begin to have domestic and family violence recognised for the serious social problem and the crime that it was and is. And after years of lobbying and public demonstrations, fed up, a group of women in Sydney took over a couple of small homes and formed the Elsie Women's Refuge after the International Women's Day March in 1974. Soon after that, I think Marrickville Refuge was the second. And within a few weeks, these two refuges were completely full, and they found themselves having to accommodate women and kids on couches. And it soon became apparent that what many women had been screaming about for many years was absolutely correct. And the awful truth was that women experiencing domestic and family violence were neither unlucky, nor did they choose or derive pleasure from the cycle of violence. The statistics that we have today are damning. This year, 1 in 7 women will experience domestic and family violence in the family home, and as many as 1 in 4 over the course of their lives. And it probably escalates to about 1 in 3 if you exclude sexual violence not committed by intimate partners. Domestic and family violence is indeed the leading cause of disability and injury for women aged 15 to 44. In men's cases, that's suicide. None of those are particularly impressive for a first world nation. And of course, domestic and family violence does not only happen to women, nor is it confined to heterosexual relationships. And the reason that I want to put this on the table up front is that one thing that I've learned through my involvement in campaigns like White Ribbon is that as soon as you publicly condemn violence against women, you become a target for so-called men's rights groups and advocates, particularly if you do so on a public platform like Twitter. They tell you that you're betraying your gender, that you're ignoring women's violence against men, their lies to the family court, and other such phenomenon. But let's be quite clear, as far as we can ascertain on the basis of the evidence, 5 out of every 6 adult victims of domestic violence in this country are women who experience abuse at the hands of male intimate partners. 5 out of every 6. And when I'm talking about domestic and family violence, I'm not talking about single incidents, though it should be made unequivocally clear that DV is never acceptable, not even once, and in fact it's a crime. By the time it comes to be reported to police, however, it's typically that it's been part of a cycle or a pattern of behaviour that is well known to specialist domestic and family violence workers, where the relationship might be going reasonably swimmingly. Then there's escalation, threats, intimidation, controlling behaviour, making women and kids feel unsafe. Then there's a critical incident, usually physical abuse, rape in the relationship, or intensive psychological abuse. Then there's the inevitable period of remorse, a period of making it up to the victim, followed by gradual escalation again, another incident, remorse, making it up, and on it goes. It's clearly a fundamental and serious violation of the right to feel safe and secure in one's home and personal space. It is probably worthwhile then giving consideration to what we might think of when we think about what a home means. It's more than a shelter, it's more than a roof over one's head, the physical barrier against the elements. They're fundamentally important, but in essence, they're a small part of what I think a home should afford. A home should offer us sanctuary from whatever perceived or actual threats, troubles, anxieties are going on in our lives. A place to come back to, the security of knowing that someone has a place from which to build connections to the community and a stable base that offers at least modest comfort and some privacy when we need it. What makes a home more than a house are the memories that we create, the relationships we can foster, having friends over, a place to raise and nurture children. And I remember meeting another child who had been living in refuges, whose one overarching wish was that she could have a friend home from school. She went to her friends' homes, but they couldn't come to hers. because she didn't have one. And central to the concept of a home, and we discussed this on the ABS statistical reference group that I sat on that led to the new homelessness definition, is the ability also to have some control over social relations in the home and to sustain health and well-being. So being subject to controlling behaviour, intimidation, abuse and physical and sexual violence shatters these fundamental concepts of home. There's no longer any control over your life, and there's certainly no sense of a home providing safety or security. The right to personal safety and freedom from harm is denied to the person. And feminist academics have argued, and indeed this has come up again very recently, that domestic and family violence is tantamount to torture. And I have to say, I'm inclined to agree with them. This thinking means that having ratified conventions relevant to preventing and punishing the crime of torture, the Australian Government has obligations and responsibility for the prevention of and response to domestic and family violence. In addition, there's the widely held view that there's an inalienable right to life, which is fundamentally threatened on a regular basis if you're living in a home in which there is regular violence. So the right to housing. 1 in 4 people who access specialist homelessness services, as Glenda said, nominate escaping domestic and family violence as their main reason for seeking assistance. So last year that was 61,000 people. A lack of resources, diminished self-esteem, threats to kill by the perpetrator, previous experiences of stalking, disempowerment, fear of reprisal against kids and pets make escaping domestic and family violence difficult. And this is compounded by a lack of affordable housing, very minimal economic resources and long waiting lists for public housing, which mean that you're probably not going to have that 4-week bond and 2 weeks rent in advance for your private rental property, even if you can find it. So where do you live? If you exhaust your family and friends, you're probably living in a car. And we know that our refuges are full on any given night. So the right to adequate housing is a fundamental human right which Australia has committed to implementing by default through its ratification of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. As a result, we should in theory be committed to implementing the right to adequate housing and taking concrete steps to progressively fulfil this right. That would require governments to take positive steps to promote and support the right through legislative, administrative and other required measures. And legislation is an important tool in protecting human rights. If we were to enact legislation enshrining a right to housing in the ACT, the government would be required to take reasonable and effective steps to progressively realise this right. Under the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, this would mean that people would have a right to legal security of tenure, the availability of housing services, materials, facilities and infrastructure to facilitate the right to housing. The housing would be affordable, habitable, accessible, be well located and culturally adequate. Thus, to be effective, it would need to be backed by clear goals and targets and a lot of resources to ensure the increased provision of housing across the ACT. And I suspect that resourcing issue is why the right to housing doesn't appear in the ACT Act or the Victorian Act. Benchmarks and targets would be needed to address structural, process and outcome related issues related to homelessness and address the shortage of housing. To be effective, it would also need to be enforceable, and that would mean providing legal avenues of recourse for people who believe they can demonstrate their right to housing has been violated, and I would expect women and children escaping domestic violence to be able to prove that pretty easily. It should be remembered that it is government and not individual service providers which must ultimately be responsible and accountable for tackling homelessness. Therefore, legislation that enshrined a right to housing must ensure that service providers were not unduly punished if they failed to comply with any standards where that failure was caused solely by insufficient funding or support for the provision of accommodation. And in the absence of a committee that could oversee the implementation of necessary measures to progress the realisation of a right to housing, at the very least, the Human Rights Act in the ACT could establish the position of a housing ombudsman. I firmly believe that the high prevalence of domestic and family violence is a national disgrace, and it's finally up to men to step up. Women have been speaking out on this issue openly for at least 50 years. And I often pose this question to my male friends. 1 in 4 women will be victims of domestic and family violence in their lifetime. So will it be your mother, your daughter, your sister, or your partner? Thanks.